everyone. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 7th of December, where I wanted to continue talking about poetry and draw your attention to some due dates and an error that unfortunately is on the syllabus. So, in terms of due dates, paper number 2 is going to be due on the 14th. That is Thursday. It'll be on drama, very similar to what you did with the short story paper. The difference is that this time you are writing about either Oedipus the King, or you are writing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, or you are writing about A Raisin in the Sun. And I've provided the same prompts where you could be writing about canon, or you could be writing about contemporary relevance, or you can create your own topic. You just want to make sure that you have that topic approved by me. And it should be about the same length. And basically, you're duplicating what you did with the first paper. And do note that I had our syllabus state that December 18th, the date of our final, is a Tuesday. And it's not a Tuesday, it's a Monday. So I will be posting our final on the 18th, which is a Monday, and that will be due on the Tuesday, which is 19th, and that'll be due 24 hours later. If we were taking this as an in-person class, you would have 2 hours approximately for your final. That's about as much as I would expect you to spend in terms of time for the final, about 2 hours, but you have 24 hours in which to complete that final if you so elect to do so. So I'll post at 8:30 a.m. and it will be due at 8:30 a.m. the following date. Most of the final will be devoted to poetry because we would not have had a chance to talk about poetry. And what I will do is just select some of the poems we've talked about in class, ask you a series of essay questions, and have you choose from within those prompts. It'll be open book, open notes. So it's a test, and you're basically synthesizing some of the major points we've talked about over the course of the semester. That said, the points that are left over after the 80 points for poetry, 10 points would be devoted to short story, 10 points would be devoted to ultimately drama. These will be shorter essay questions. Again, I will give you choice within those. So, in terms of our poetry section, I had several poems assigned for today. The first being The Author to Her Book by Anne Bradstreet. Yet another poem from the 1600s, and we've already done a couple of poems from the 1600s. I tend to be fond of the 1600s, so I admit my bias here. I think one of the interesting things about this poem is that although it was written in 1678, it's a poem that was written by a female author. This was very much a male-centric time in terms of poetry. And I suspect that one of the reasons why this poem exists is because this poem talks about a subject matter that's associated with female motherhood, but it compares it to something that wouldn't necessarily be associated with female during the times, and that would be authorship. And I was able to find a link for this poem, but it also is included on page 692 of the edition of your textbook. And if I were to read this poem to you, because we've talked a little bit about the importance of listening to the orality of a poem. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being not mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. And better dressed to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father ask, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. And we're told a little bit about this poem in the textbook. This is an extended metaphor, so it's comparing two things that are very unlike one another. That would be motherhood and authorship, and showing the commonality between them. It's extended because it's continued throughout the entire poem. It's very much like the poem Catch that we had talked about earlier, comparing a game of catch to reading and writing poetry. And there are lots of parallels that are associated with motherhood as well as authorship. And while this is an author who's talking to her book, perhaps you can relate as a student who is writing to their paper or talking to their soon-to-be due paper number 2, calling it "thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain." So there's a sense of disappointment in this product. Who after birth did by my side remain, which is what happens with a baby, stays with their parent, their mother initially, just like your piece of writing is in effect your baby, and it stays with you until it's ready to go off into the public, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true. Eventually you've got to share that child, and eventually you've got to share that writing with others, who thee abroad exposed to public view. And now that the public is viewing this child or this piece of writing, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. Well, everybody is judging that piece of writing or that baby, and basically that judgment is a reflection upon you. At thy return my blushing was not small, because eventually that child, if you've shared your child with family and friends, is going to have to return to you. Your writing will eventually come back to you after it's been evaluated. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. The idea that you can't control this child or the writing. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. So there's a sense of frustration and disappointment with this product, whether it be the writing or it be the child. Yet be mine own at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. So despite the frustration and disappointment, there's still love and affection. I watched thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. And the idea of trying to improve something, you actually make it worse, which can oftentimes happen in the editing process. This is in relation to a child in this instance. I stretch thy joints to make thee even feet, but still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. Some punning going on there because we talk about the syllables or the meter of a poem based on the number of feet that it has. Obviously, children and humans have feet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. Whether dressing up that child in their Sunday best, so to speak, or dressing up your paper by using, let's say, a fancy font, but that's not going to improve the quality in any way. In this array vulgars mayst thou roam. The idea of roaming and rambling brat, unable to control the writing or the child, because it has a mind of its own. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. So everyone is a critic, and you want to be careful not to expose your writing or your child to strangers, because they probably will be more harsh. If for thy father asked, say thou had none. It's kind of interesting, the idea of single parenthood during this time period. But think about how it might relate to the idea of writing, that you're supposed to write on your own, not necessarily with using other help like other writers. So in some ways you are kind of single parent when you're a writer. And for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. That eventually the child needs to be sent off on its own to take care of itself because the mother can't continue to support it. Same with the piece of writing. Eventually you're poor and you need a grade or you need a commission, so you need to send your writing off. So I like that poem in terms of the extended metaphor, but also that we have a female author. The 1700s, the poem that I selected is The Sick Rose by William Blake. Only one poem from the 1700s. The first to admit I'm not the biggest fan of the 1700s. That said, I do like The Sick Rose. It's an example of romantic poetry. Romantic poetry not necessarily meaning a romance between two people. The Romantics who wrote during the 1700s were known for observing nature and celebrating the beauty of nature, and how that beauty could oftentimes be compared to the human world. And in The Sick Rose, one of the reasons why I like this poem is because at this point in the semester, you've probably been conditioned to assume that you can't read something literally. And the Romantics were meant to be read literally. But of course, as we know, that beyond the literal, there also is symbolic. And The Sick Rose was not included in your textbook. It's listed in what I call handout because it was not included in the textbook that I had ordered. It was basically included in the previous versions of the textbook. I've included this in our handout that I have included links for. One of the things I like about The Sick Rose is that it's so general that it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And of course, the first question is, what is this rose and why is it sick? As we're told, "O rose, thou art sick." And then the poem continues on and it talks about the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Might I suggest this poem can be read literally, that it really is about a flower or a rose that's being attacked by some sort of parasite or insect. In this instance, the worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, which gives us this dark setting of something being amiss. And that the crimson bed is basically the bed of flowers, the roses being red. And this is how the rose's life is destroyed through the worm. You think about the food chain where one life subsists over another. But of course, it can be read symbolically. We spent a lot of time with the Rose for Emily trying to talk about all of the ways that rose could be a symbol. Perhaps rose is the name of a woman. And perhaps this poem is about a woman who's sick, whether it is a literal illness, whether it's an emotional illness. That worm could be corruption, it could be death, it could be literal illness. Worms also represent death, but in addition, worms can be seen as phallic symbols. And perhaps this is a woman's loss of virginity, or this is the loss of a woman's reputation through an illicit affair, and that's how her life is destroyed. The bed of crimson joy, the bed is oftentimes where someone takes to when they're sick or when they want to have a moment of intimacy. And, of course, crimson could be in reference to blood, which suggests violence, which suggests illness. It can also suggest a loss of virginity as well, with a loss of blood. So this poem can be read in so many different ways. It's only 8 lines long, but might I suggest that it could be an 8-page paper if you so wanted to, talking about all of the possibilities of rose. But I did want to emphasize that you should read this poem literally about the beauty of a rose and the death of a rose through the worm, as well as read it possibly symbolically. The next poem that I chose was from the 1800s. Only one poem from the 1800s, so I'm well aware that we were heavy on the 1600s. And this choice was not that difficult. The choice is Emily Dickinson. And when we think about Emily Dickinson, well, we think about Amherst, Massachusetts, which is where she was born and raised. In fact, that's where the Emily Dickinson Museum is, and I've included a link below in the notes where you could actually go and visit the Emily Dickinson Museum, which I encourage you to do, or at the very least, I encourage you to spend some time looking at the website. And the story behind Emily Dickinson is probably just as interesting as talking a little bit about her writing, in that she lived a very unusual life, reclusive. In fact, in our terminology, we'd probably call it agoraphobic, afraid to go outside. She did go to college, Mount Holyoke, though college at the time was a place where women were groomed to be wives and mothers and to basically be the spiritual foundation of the home. Emily Dickinson never married, never became a mother, and quite openly indicated that she didn't think much of organized religion. In fact, she refused to go to church. That would have been quite noticeable during this time period, from Dickinson coming from a rather affluent family in Amherst, where church going was as much political as it was spiritual. That's not to say that Dickinson wasn't spiritual. She was very spiritual. She just didn't believe in organized religion. And in terms of the way that she led her life, she basically spent it mostly in her bedroom, writing thousands of poems, and they were not meant for public consumption. However, they were published after her death and by her sister, and sadly, they were, quote, corrected for mechanical errors, which is nonsense when you come to poetry, because poetry can break all of the rules. And really, people didn't think much of her poetry until a new edition came out in the 1950s, 1960s by an editor named Johnson, publishing her poetry in the way that she wrote it. And now the poetry becomes much more interesting. It's much more raw, it's much more defiant, and it breaks many more conventions. So you want to make sure that you're reading the correct Emily Dickinson poetry. I've included the page number from our text, but also a link. Many of the links you'll see that I've included from the Poetry Foundation, which is a very good link for finding poetry. But the quick and the easy way to tell whether or not you're reading something that Dickinson herself wrote or not is look for the dashes, because at the ending of her lines, she favored using dashes. As you can see on page 847, if you're using the edition of the book I had ordered. From a grammatical perspective, it would not be correct to use a dash. We would use a comma or no punctuation whatsoever. But the dash is a very long pause, so it leads to a kind of dramatic element for the next line. A dash is almost like the long pause you take before the, let's say, punchline of a joke. Also, dashes help to mimic the natural pauses churchgoers would have if they were singing hymnals in church. And her poetry oftentimes follows the format of a hymnal. Again, it's one of the ways that her poetry is subversive. She's not religious, and yet she's taking something that's religious and she's making it into her own poetry. And there is a musical quality to poetry, to all poetry. And when she talks about in her poem, because I could not stop for death, we immediately see how she also has irregular capitalizations because death is capitalized. In this instance, it makes sense that death is capitalized because death is personified, giving human qualities to inanimate objects. But there are many other instances where she capitalizes and it's not so clear. In fact, her poetry is rather dense and unclear. I have to admit that when I was a college student, I didn't much care for her poetry because I didn't understand it. And it was only after the fact when I heard that scholars and critics who had devoted themselves to Dickinson didn't completely understand her poetry either, that I felt much better about Dickinson's poetry. I've often suggested that instead of trying to understand an entire poem, that you just try to understand a line or two. Oftentimes her lines can be so filled with meaning. One of my favorites being from another poem that basically states, one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted, which is a line that we talk about a great deal in my Gothic literature class. But nevertheless, this poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, is one of her easier poems to understand. Her poetry is usually written in the I, so it's very personal, but it's also very universal because it's something that I think many people can relate to. Because what she's trying to do in her poetry is to express feelings in words. She's one of the best poets I know who's able to express these abstract feelings into concrete words. And it's not an easy thing to do. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why Emily Dickinson's poetry is so challenging. But in terms of reading this poem to you, you can see that it's divided up into stanzas if you're looking at this poem. So basically stanzas are much like paragraphs. So you've got divisions, and a stanza acts much like a paragraph in that it deals with a different topic. And the poem in its entirety reads, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Now, that said, if this is the first time you're hearing this poem, and I certainly hope not, because you should read these poems before you watch these videos, but the first reading is probably going to result in a lot of confusion. So you want to reread. You have to reread poetry. And I suggest that for a poem that's divided up into stanzas, you might want to tackle it stanza by stanza. So the first stanza, and note that Emily Dickinson's poetry is not titled, so we refer to her poems by the first line or by their number because they've been given a numerical order by scholars. But the first line is, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Notice how death is referred to as kind, which is somewhat unusual when we think of death. And the idea is that we don't stop for death. We don't have control to decide when we die. Death stops for us. Death makes the decision. The carriage held by just ourselves and immortality. And the reason why death is kind is because death brings immortality, according to Dickinson. So it's not the ending, it's the beginning of a better life. And there's a long tradition of talking about life as a journey. And in this carriage, because there wouldn't have been automobiles during the time period, you're in that journey of life. And we slowly drove. He knew no haste, because you don't need to worry about time in the afterlife, because the afterlife is eternal. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. So now death has been called kind and civil. And in the afterlife, there is no labor nor leisure. The only reason why we need leisure in our world is because we labor. But all of those are human constructs that wouldn't exist in the afterlife. It's a completely different conception of the world. We pass before the school where children strove at recess in the ring. And this represents the early stage of life, childhood, where children are in school, learning and playing. The ring is in reference to Ring Around the Rosy, Pocket Full of Posy, which actually happens to be a song about the plague and death. So it's very appropriate that she should mention the children in the ring. We pass the fields of gazing grain. That's supposed to represent adulthood and the time of work, gazing grain being for farmers. And our time period, perhaps what might be more appropriate would be office work. We pass the setting sun. So that's supposed to represent the ending of life, old age. Or rather, he passed us. Basically, they're moving away from the earthly realm and moving into the spiritual. The dews drew quivering and chill. So now there's a change in environment. And for my gown, it's only gossamer. Gossamer is something that's very thin and very insubstantial, oftentimes associated with fairy tales. And tippet, and we're given a definition for tippet here in our textbook, that's a shawl. Only tulle. Tulle is another thin fabric. It's what tutus are made out of, wedding veils, things of that nature. So basically, she's wearing very thin and insubstantial clothing, even though the dews drew quivering and chill. But keep in mind, when you move to the afterlife, you don't need to worry about the weather or the environment either. That's another human element. And we wear clothing for two reasons in our existence, either for protection against the elements or for social convention, and both would be irrelevant in the afterlife. We pause before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. House is capitalized, which is what we usually do with proper nouns. Not that those are the only words that Dickinson capitalizes. But this house, it could represent the house of God, a church. It could represent a crypt. This is going to be her house, in effect, for her corpse. It could represent her literal house because she spent so much time in her room. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. The cornice in the ground. The cornice is an architectural element of a roof. In other words, this house is so far away, it just seems like a little dot in the horizon. This is how far away they're moving from the earthly realm, moving into the spiritual. And then we have the last stanza, the most important stanza perhaps in this poem, where it says, since then 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day. And the idea is that this happened centuries ago. So she's speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. This happened long ago. This poem serves as proof of the afterlife. Not because a preacher is talking about the afterlife in a church, but this is an eyewitness account, if you will, of the afterlife, that Emily Dickinson often talks about death from the perspective of the dead. And many people have talked about Emily Dickinson's poetry being somewhat pessimistic because it's oftentimes about death. But she doesn't portray death in a negative way. She usually portrays it in quite the positive, as we see here. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And of course, the horses' heads are literal because they're pulling the carriage. But they also are a biblical reference. How surprising for someone who doesn't necessarily support organized religion to use a biblical reference. The horses' heads reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So this is in reference to Armageddon, the ending of the world. And the idea is that this poem isn't just talking about her specific death, but the death of all life, which is what's supposed to happen during Armageddon, which leads to new life, everlasting life. Now, of course, part of the way that we interpret poetry is based on ultimately the way the poem is read. So there are professional readers who read poetry. I always think of Patrick Stewart, very famous actor. Probably you know him best from Star Trek fame as Captain Picard. But he engaged in an experiment during the early days of COVID where he recorded himself reading a sonnet a day of Shakespeare's sonnets, thinking that COVID would end before the sonnets. It turns out the sonnets ended before COVID. Shakespeare wrote over 100 of them. But one of the sonnets that he read, and I'll never forget this, is, and Patrick Stewart is a Shakespearean trained actor, so he's well suited to doing this. He began reading the sonnet and stopped around the second line or so and said, no, no, no. And then he restarted and he read it in a different way. So again, it's not to say that one way is better than another, though from his opinion, he was reading it the wrong way initially when he started. And he left that in there rather than editing that out. So I always use this as an example about how poetry, in some ways, is like drama. It's based on interpretation. Much like an actor can decide how to read their lines, a poet can decide how to read their poem, whether it's the actual poet themselves who's actually written the poem, and they might do a good or a bad job, just like somebody who's written a song might sing their own song and might do a good or a bad job. And then there are also professional poets, and they will all read it differently. And I liken this to music. And the example I'm going to give is of a song that you may have heard of. It's quite poetic, and some songs are very, very poetic. It's called The Sounds of Silence, made famous by Simon and Garfunkel. And if you listen to the lyrics, or if you read the lyrics, and I'm actually going to have you do that because you'll see in the notes below, I've got a video of Simon and Garfunkel singing their song where the lyrics are there. And just the term, the sounds of silence, and that seeming contradiction, that's a poem in and of itself, and an analysis of a line. When he talks about how silence, or they sing about how silence like a cancer grows, and that the words of prophets are on the subway walls and tenement halls. That's as poetic as any of the poetry that we're reading. And they sing it, in a very gentle, folksy kind of way. You may be familiar with the band Disturbed. If you're not, you will be, because you'll see that in the notes below, I've included their cover of The Sounds of Silence. What's so interesting about that is that Simon and Garfunkel, the originators of the song, not only like the cover, but indicate that perhaps the cover might even be better than their own original version. That doesn't happen often with artists. And you'll see that when Disturbed sings the same song with the same lyrics, there's a very different sense to it. And instead of it being gentle, it's very angry and very dramatic. It's not that one way is better than another. It's just a different interpretation. So keep that in mind as you're hearing me and others read poetry. Sometimes we'll be able to hear professional poets read their poetry as well. But I'll leave you with those two videos from Simon and Garfunkel and Disturbed, The Sounds of Silence, because the lyrics really are poetic. And I will also leave you with thinking about one last poem that is not included in our textbook. It's included in our handout. It's called American Poetry by Louis Simpson. And it's a poem that I chose that deliberately breaks the chronology. I've been trying to keep to chronological order with the poetry. As few of the poems that we're reading, you can still see a kind of sense of progression. And that said, this poem breaks out of the chronology because it really anticipates some of the more contemporary poems we're going to be reading from the 1900s. And it also anticipates some of the shifts we're going to see as we move from British poetry to American poetry. Though, of course, Emily Dickinson was an American poet. So, that said, perhaps her poetry is a little bit more traditional than some of what American poetry is suggesting you will find with American poetry. I suggest we will also find that from poetry written in the 1900s and the 2000s. So this is where we will pick up next class, is talking about American poetry. But enjoy The Sounds of Silence, both versions of it. What's left is our attendance question for the day. So our attendance question is going to be about the 3 poems that I discussed today. And out of the 3, which one did you like best and why? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer to this. What's more interesting is your reasoning or your rationale. So based on the 3 poems, the author to her book, The Sick Rose, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which one did you like the most and why? And that said, I've fallen a little bit behind with my discussion forum responses, as you probably have noticed. I plan on catching up this weekend. And this response will be due on Saturday the 9th. Though certainly if you need additional time, feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well, or certainly much better. I'm on the mend, and enjoy 2 different versions of The Sounds of Silence. Take care. Bye-bye.